So I'm going to talk about, Buffy and I are going to talk about advancing research with clinical trials. And what I thought we could go through was just a little bit of a primer, if you will, or a little bit of an understanding of the types of clinical trials, phases of clinical trials, what it means for participation, what rights you have within it. So just I have some obligatory disclosures, so just those. So what is a clinical trial? So a clinical trial, or maybe some of you have heard them called protocols, are research studies to explore whether a medical strategy, treatment, or device is safe and effective for humans. So clinical trials are the final step in the drug development process with the FDA, and that's probably true. It is true both here and in Europe. So the FDA here and the EMA, or the European Medical Association in Europe. Participants in clinical trials are protected by oversight committees that help ensure safe and ethical treatment. So why are they important? Well, as I said, that they are part of the drug development process, so no drug that is on the market, either over the counter or prescription, has evaded this process. So they all have to go through this process, and that's what the FDA does. So they are actually a scientific way of evaluating a new approach to see if it's safe, efficacious, and can help target the groups that may benefit from the best approach. And then they're designed to reduce, clinical trials are designed to reduce bias, any undue influence, and they're designed to show results that could be reproducible so that it's just not a one-time phenomenon that they actually have done. So they're designed with a certain degree of scientific rigor. Who sponsors clinical trials? So trials can be sponsored by either physicians, and those we call PI-initiated trials, drug companies such as Takeda, Grifols, or collaborative organizations, sometimes like NIAID or some of the groups within the NIH, or there's this PIDTC, I don't know if people, the Primary Immune Disease Consortium, those are collective physicians that get together and all run one trial. So that's the sponsor. And then, as I said, there's national organizations such as the National Institute for Health, the Allergy and Immunology, the NCI for cancer trials. And the sponsor of the protocol actually provides the money and the drug. It's generally how it is. So. And then actually, just to go back one piece to that, is the sponsor usually provides the money and the drug. The actual clinical care and the actual trial itself happens at local institutions, so it can happen with your doctor or your hospital. So those are called the sites versus the sponsor. So there are different types of clinical trials. There's probably what is most commonly known for people is a treatment or an interventional trial, and this generally involves an intervention or with a new medication or a type of psychotherapy or a new device or a new approach, surgery or radiation. There are also prevention trials. These look for better ways to prevent disorders from developing or from becoming worse. Examples of those are low sodium diet to prevent hypertension or those kind of screening studies for cancer. And then there's a diagnostic which looks at better ways of screening or identifying or diagnosing new disorders or conditions. Screening studies are also a type of diagnostic study to learn more ways of detecting disorders. And then there are natural history studies, which are very prevalent in chronic disease populations and certainly in the primary immune deficiency world, and that this is our way of looking at how does disease occur, in which groups, is there any sort of factors that we can try to elucidate out that make things clear and actually help with diagnostic testing and developing new treatments down the road. So this really relates to phases of treatment trials, but this does relate to the interventional trials, and by that I'm talking about biologics, drugs, and whatever. So the first phase is a phase 1 or a pilot study, and this is usually the first time in humans, and this is that they've actually gone through and determined by animal studies and what we call in preclinical or in vivo that they're safe. So we're actually going to move on to humans. And these are phase 1, first time in humans, and they're usually in a very small group, and generally they're in normal volunteers, people without any disease, because what you're really trying to find out is it safe? And so, they're really doing basic safety studies in humans with this. In certain diseases, PI is not one of those diseases generally, and cancer comes to mind. They do phase 1 trials in humans because usually there's no other alternative therapy. And for a lot of patients, this is just a new phenomenon. It's called the right to try, which was a new bill for that. But it does allow people at the end of their life, especially in cancer and in life-threatening illnesses like that, to try a drug that has never been used before, but not in PI. And then this is a staggered approach, so if you will, it builds on each other. But once you've completed a phase 1 and you know that the data demonstrates that it's safe, then they'll move on to a phase 2, and that tests the drug in a larger group of patients with the disease you're targeting. And then this phase, now we know what the safety is, so now we're trying to try to determine the effectiveness of it and determine the optimal dose. So this is sometimes they're dose escalation studies. So if you were to enter a study, they may tell you you're going to be in group 1, 2, or 3, and it kind of tiers up. You start at the low dose, middle, and you're trying to find where's the sweet spot, where's the place that you get the most bang for your buck, if you will, with the least amount of adverse events. Once those two are done, the phase 3 trials are the ones that are really popular and that you'll see on the TV. You'll see people advertise for them. These are very large studies. These are usually, in some diseases, can be up to thousands of people. And these are multi-site. They evaluate the drug against the standard of care. These are common for instances in this. It would be comparing 2 IVIGs. Is this one better than that one? Is sub-Q better than IV? So you already have an approved standard of care that is what people take, and you're looking to see. We used to say you wanted one that was better, and the FDA's new wording about that is non-inferior, which is a little bit of wordsmithing, but you don't have to be better, you just have to be as good as. And I think that actually is part of marketing is to give people more options in the marketplace, so in that way it does make sense. And then if that's the last one if all of those 3 come, the drug is safe, it's efficacious, then you can submit that data to the FDA, and the FDA will look at that to license your product or to get FDA approval, if you will. Phase 4 is that's asked by the FDA for studies conducted after FDA approval, and what you're actually looking for is monitoring for long-term side effects. Some of these drugs, especially some of the newer drugs, the biologics, the gene therapies, some of these drugs are what they're calling on breakthrough technology and fast-tracking them, which is a very new approach from the FDA to get them to the patient quicker. So it's well-intended, but the downstream unintended consequence is that you may not have all the longitudinal, the long-time data of safety. Like for amoxicillin is a good example. Amoxicillin has been out there forever, so those trials went on for 5 years. So by the time they marketed that, you knew what the long term is. These drugs are going through in 2-3 years, so you really don't know what's going to happen. So the phase 4 studies are becoming more and more popular, and they're actually important. And so what they are doing is they monitor the patient for outcomes. So did they have any untoward effects 5 years after they got the drug or whatever. So, and I say that because if you enroll in any of these or you get a product that's recently improved, they may ask you to register for one of those trials. Wrong way, sorry. So just some clinical trial terms to know, so a little vocabulary drill here. So randomized, so you may sometimes hear of a randomized clinical trial, and this is a scientific method to reduce bias within groups. So a flip of the coin, we tell patients you have a 50-50 chance of receiving either the drug or an alternative or a placebo or the standard treatment, depending on the design of the trial. And most randomized trials are 50-50. There are some that are 2/3 or 1/3, 2/3, but you'll know that up front, but most of them are 50-50. Blinded. So blinded is a term used to say that you, the doctor, me as the research nurse, would not know whether you were getting, what drug you were getting or drug or placebo. The person who would know is the pharmacist. And certainly in certain situations, dire situations, that blind can be broken, but this is the way of removing any bias. And then placebo, and as I said, there are non-active substances designed to look like the study drug, so you've heard sugar pill or saline. Rarely used in primary immune deficiencies. They're really not for a lot of indications where, where withholding treatment would be deleterious or would be not in somebody's best interest. So a lot of these trials don't have this arm to them, but I tell you that just in case you hear that. So what are the benefits of participating in a clinical trial? Well, for one thing, you have access to a new drug or treatment that may otherwise not be available to you yet because it hasn't gone through the FDA approval process. It's an increased opportunity to learn about your disease condition and how to take care of it, because one of the things is that you actually probably get more care than you would if you weren't in a trial because of the monitoring and the visits and whatever. So you have more interaction with a clinical team than you may usually have, and that can be good or bad depending on your lifestyle. Clinical care from an expert in the field. So a lot of especially the phase 1s, the early phase 1s and 2s, are done at large metropolitan medical centers with some of the leading experts in the field as the investigators. So it does give you access to that. Medical care and treatment at no cost to you, which is another, for some people that is not certainly to be coercive, but certainly something to be considered. For some, there are possible compensation. Certainly, and I'll talk about this in a minute, but the ethics boards at the hospitals where you're going to get your care or where a study site take this very seriously because what they don't want to do is coerce you into doing it for money. But some of the compensations you may see is parking, transportation to the study site, housing. Some of the studies I run at Boston Children's, we'll fly the patient to Boston, we'll put you up at a hotel. You'll be in the hospital. We don't give you any money to be in the trial. We don't pay you $1,500, but we do try to make it convenient for you. And those are acceptable. That's not an inducement or a coercion, but just a consideration. And then certainly for some people it's altruistic, the satisfaction. It may not help you, but it may help somebody else. Oh, did you want that back? Okay. So some of the risks of being in the clinical trial is that you may, as I said, may or may not receive the study drug of interest. There could be unknown side effects. We usually, by the time it gets to a phase 1, and phase 1 actually is where we do start finding the side effects, but we think in the informed consent document, we list out everything we know could happen from the drug, but again, humans are humans, and you never know how anything is going to react to any particular person, so we can't with 100% guarantee say this won't happen or that will happen. So that's an unknown risk. There's a chance that the treatment or the study drug just won't work for you, for your biology or whatever, or won't work for anybody. You may need more frequent monitoring, and as I said, depending on your lifestyle, your work, your school, that could be good or bad. You may need to come more frequently than you would or not. And tied to that is there'll be additional visits to the study center or the clinical site. And when I said the sponsor sponsors the study and then each doctor, is a site, it's generally not every doctor, in that area. So you would have to, maybe if you're used to going to Children's Hospital of Philadelphia and we're the only place offering it, you may have to come to Boston to see one of our doctors to participate. So just a consideration. But there are some rights that you need to know before you say yes and you sign on the dotted line. So you have the right to know who is doing the study, who's paying for it, who's sponsoring it, who is the investigative doctor or the PI, we call it, so you'll hear those acronyms. Why? Why is the study being done? Why is it different than the standard of care or any existing medication available? What will I have to do to participate? What will it cost me? What will it cost? Will it cost my insurance company? And it could cost your insurance company. And what I say is there are some trials that we bill the insurance company for any part of that trial that would be standard of care. So transplant studies, gene therapy studies, you come in the hospital and you're going to get admitted to the hospital. If you were going to get an allo transplant, your insurance company would be paying for your labs, your chemotherapy, all of that. We will seek approval from your insurance company to get those costs covered, not the research costs. We're very strict about that. 99% of the time I get coverage for those things. But you would want to know, are they going to ask your insurance company? And a lot of them won't, and they'll pay in total for everything, but you would want to know that, going into it. And then when? When would you need to come for visits? When will I know if it's working? And where? Where will I need to go to the study visit? As I said, sometimes they're only at certain centers. And how long will I need to come back and forth? And where will I go if I have side effects? If you live in Chicago and I'm in Boston with the trial, we need to set up a plan for what's going to happen, like, with your doctor and whatever. So it's a lot of coordination, but it's certainly, you can see it. There's a lot of involvement at the patient end. And you have rights as a research subject. You have a right to withdraw your consent at any time without any consequences to your care. And I always say this to patients as long as I've been a researcher, this is the most important part. You can walk away from anything at any time. You have the right to have all your questions answered to your satisfaction prior to joining the study and signing the informed consent. So what I always caution patients is if somebody tells you got to sign this today, you don't need to sign anything today. There's nothing we're going to do in research that is that emergent that can't wait 24 hours for you to go home and read that. You have the right to privacy, and the research staff will not share your health information with anyone without your written consent. And you have the right to know about any new risks or findings that are discovered during the trial. And then one of the other rights that you have is during the consenting process, in the consent, it should tell you what are the risks for the study, certainly, that are known to be the risks of the drug or the biologic or the device, but also what are your alternatives. So what is the current standard of care, what else you could do. Sometimes you could do nothing, but all of those things would have to be identified for you. And there are protections and safeguards for clinical trials. So the first one is the institution where the study is going to take place has what is called an Institutional Review Board, or an IRB. Some other places call them CCIs, Committee, Ethics Boards, Committee for Investigation. They're all the same. They're human subject protection agencies, and the protocol or the study has to go through them. What constitutes this? A board of people. There's usually physicians not involved with the study. There's a lawyer. There's an ethicist. There's parents or lay people in the community, and all of them sit around. And what their job is it safe and is it ethical to do this in a human being? They have no skin in the game, so to speak. It's not their trial. It may be their institution, but that's where the boundaries are. There's also a federal agency. You're protected under the OHRP, the Office of Human Subject Research Protection, and this oversees all the IRBs. So you have the IRB at the local level, then you have the federal government telling them what they have to do, and there are very strict rules and regulations around what the consent has to look like the same elements in every hospital in the United States. And then within every study, there's something called the Data Safety Monitoring Board. This is made up of an independent panel of people not involved in the study, but generally tend to be experts in the field you're studying. So maybe an immunologist, bone marrow transplant doctor. Periodically throughout the study, they will get data, de-identified, meaning they don't know it's you, you're 003, all of your safety data. What adverse events have you had? What labs look out of whack? And they look at all that data as a set to see if there's any trends in things that, they're more objectively looking at it, saying, we should stop this, so you should be looking at this. And then ultimately, the overseer of all of this is the Food and Drug Administration, so nothing goes into a patient without the Food and Drug Administration, the protocol being vetted by them first. So as you can see, it's a pretty rigorous process, and it's actually, I think it's got pretty tight oversight. As I said, you have to sign an informed consent, and an informed consent, I believe, is a living document, and it is a process. It's informing you of all of the things that can go wrong, can go right, your rights, when you can stop, when you don't have to stop. It has risks, it has benefits, alternatives, and it's an ongoing process. And as you will be more, you should be, and you're entitled to, and you should expect to be informed of any changes in that protocol as it goes along. New data that comes up, new changes, new adverse events that weren't in the consent. All of those things should be, be ongoing with you, and that should be a dialogue you either have with your physician, the investigator, your research nurse if there's a nurse involved, but somebody should be educating you along the way. You must sign the consent prior to them doing anything, so here's another tip. Not only should you not sign until you're ready, but if anybody says, well, we're going to draw these labs, and then we'll know if you can go on the study, it doesn't work that way. You sign, and then you draw the lab. So that's the order of operation in that. But people aren't doing it to break the law, but sometimes people try to do things in a more expedient way. And then before you sign the consent, you should have all your questions answered by the investigative team. And then you have a right to the copy of that signed consent. They should give you, and they're actually mandated to give you a copy. And so for children in research, this is near to my heart as a long-term pediatric nurse, children get special protection under the law in research because they're considered a vulnerable population. Children, pregnant women, prisoners, there are certain populations that we deem vulnerable. Parents and legal guardians must give written consent for their children under 18, but if the study is, and also if the study is deemed to be greater than minimal risk to the child, both parents may be required to sign the informed consent if possible. And that even includes parents that are not together. There are some high-risk trials. For instance, I run gene therapy trials at Boston Children's. We exclusively ask for both parents to be consenting, both of those, for kids. I mean, some of these things they're a really big deal, so you want to make sure that everybody's involved. Children over the age of 7 may be asked to have an assent signed. So an assent document is actually, it's a consent, if you will. It's more of an acknowledgement to the child that explaining in very age-appropriate language, developmentally appropriate language, what's going to happen to them. Like, you don't certainly have to talk about, lab values and obscure medical terms, but in basic ways. You're going to take this medication, you're going to do this, you're going to have to come to the hospital. And this varies by institution, but we in pediatrics, I think, and in most children's hospitals, take this pretty seriously. So if I had a 14-year-old who said, I don't think so, we wouldn't go forward until we were all in agreement. If I had a 7-year-old, who is just a little needle phobic, I still wouldn't go right ahead, but there's a little bit more of a negotiation and a talk about that and maybe readdressing it. But if I have a teenager who says, I don't think I'm doing this, we may not, and we've gone all the way to ethics consults internally with that, and so I think you'll find at most pediatric institutions, they take that assent very seriously. And so here's some sources, and Buffy certainly will give you much more sources, and we have some on the tables of where you can find information about clinical trials, where you can find more disease-focused clinical trials for PI.
So now that you have an idea of what comprises a clinical trial, different phases, this is how you can find them when you want to look for one. I am also on the Nurse Advisory Committee. So now that you're close to Washington, you might spend another few days here and explore the 3 national libraries. The first is the Library of Congress, which is this building back here. And the Library of Congress, is the world's largest library with millions of items in thousands of languages. It is the Congressional Research Service. It is the home of the Copyright Office. Then there's the National Library of Agriculture, which is just in suburban Maryland, the world's largest collection of materials on food science and agriculture. They have their own database called Agricola, which is fantastic. And then my personal favorite, the National Library of Medicine, which is part of the NIH. It's one of the institutes of the NIH, although they don't think they are, but they are. And this is the world's largest biomedical collection in the world. And so the lower building with the little nurse's cap on top, that's the actual library. The taller building is where they create and maintain hundreds of databases that are very useful to the public, one of which is Genetics Home Reference. In this file, you can find information on literally anything that has a genetic component. Any disease, any tumor, anything. You can type in the name, you can type in the gene. And the other one they load is clinicaltrials.gov. This is how you can find information on a clinical trial. This is your tax money hard at work. These are created and maintained for the public. So in Genetics Home Reference, and there's materials on that table in the back, you can take whatever you want. There's thousands of summaries on 1,200 plus health conditions, 1,400 genes, And they have a textbook embedded in that site, and we'll go to it in a minute, that is Help Me Understand Genetics. It's fundamental genetics. Very simple. Even high school students can understand it. They have experts from around NIH and around the country that review the data, and it's updated on a regular basis. There are also 250 support and advocacy groups, including IDF, that look at this material and are referenced at the end of every entry. They'll put links to other things. So the audience for this is everyone: patients, students, healthcare professionals. It's very understandable. It's really useful. They get 3.3 million page views a month, 1.7 users per month. They have a website that's updated weekly, and they had recently redesigned. So we'll just look at this. So this is the first page, and that little yellow box, just type in something, Job syndrome, or you can type in primary immune deficiency. The broader you are, the more you'll get, but it will be less specific. The more specific you are, the less you'll get, and it might miss things, and you'll see. So here, I just typed in Job, but it also reads it as job, because it just is a machine. And so the first item, autosomal dominant hyper IgE, that is a correct association with that. And all of these actually are, and so you can choose anything that you're interested in. This NF1 gene, that is not exactly correct at all, because at the end of the line it says can perform its normal job of initiating. So that's wrong. But you just browse through and see what looks interesting. And so these are descriptions of whatever you typed in. This is not the trial. These are descriptive entries that will give you the gene, will give you the consequences of the gene, and anyway. So this is like the beginning of the entry. Very long descriptions, easily understandable, and then related stuff on the sides if you're interested in what if I'm a carrier, what if I haven't. And then at the end of every entry they have all these extra links, and these are all clickable. The frequency, the changes, learn more about the gene, the inheritance pattern, diagnostics, what testing to do, other diagnostics, and then this general information from Medline Plus. This is a database of biomedical literature that goes to the journals and pulls references that will link this disorder to an actual journal paper. And you can't always then click on it and get the full text, but you get the reference, and then you can find a librarian that can get you that, or get your doctor that if you get it at his library. And many more things. So this third one, Genetic and Rare Disease Information System, this is also called GARD. This is a very powerful source of information on rare diseases, including PI diseases. Many more NIH resources. IDF would be in the second to last one, Patient Support and Advocacy. And the last one, Gene Reviews, is another excellent database, but highly, highly technical, that can give you very detailed information if that's something that you're interested in. And there is a link right there on top, clinicaltrials.gov. So if that hit, the first hit, it gave you something useful, you can continue on from that, or you can try it again and do hyper IgE instead if you don't want to just put job or Job. Then there were more scientific articles, and the second to last OMIM is Online Mendelian Inheritance in Man. This is a massive catalog that is intense descriptions, very detailed, of the gene. It's not for everybody, but it's a very good source. So we're going to talk about so to find the gene or to find information broadly on a disease or a condition, use Genetics Home Reference. It's tremendous. Then you want to find a trial because now you know what you're looking for and you want to find a trial. So this database, also maintained by the National Library of Medicine, is clinicaltrials.gov. This contains all clinical trials, whether they're from a drug company that's the sponsor, where the government is the sponsor, where the Pentagon is the sponsor. All over the world you can find a trial if one exists. It's not limited. And trials that are supported by the NIH, and over 80% of the NIH budget goes to external trials that are not conducted on the NIH campus. They are conducted in university settings, at Boston Children's, all over. they really seriously require, not just encourage, require that results are entered into clinicaltrials.gov at certain phases. So as the trial changes from phase 1, phase 2, there's going to be results of some kind. That's how it's going to progress. And those results are going to be reported in clinicaltrials.gov, so you can look at the progress. So if you just happen on a study and they're already in phase 3, well, you can go back and look and see how many people were initially enrolled, how many continue to be enrolled, have there been any complications, what are the changes that happen that they're able to progress to the next phase. And people in a trial are monitored for a long time. You don't necessarily have to go from every phase in a trial. You can stop at a particular phase, but you'll still be monitored because there still might be consequences from whatever medicine you got, or if a new device that maybe you got something implanted, some kind of pacemaker or something, and maybe things have changed. Maybe they're looking at how do the wires that go in your heart really work, and maybe this wire had a better conduction than that wire, and so, but still you'll be monitored. And you are monitored for a long time because that's part of the study. So clinical trials vary in purpose, wide variety of populations. Sometimes they take healthy volunteers to test not so much interventional things, but sometimes for techniques, maybe a new kind of an insulin pump, or maybe a new kind of joint for your hip replacement. And they can take healthy volunteers that are willing to do that. I don't know why. But, it's interesting to see all the kinds of things that people will sign up for. Sometimes they get paid. That's a motivation. That doesn't mean it's bad. It's just that's what they do. And there are a wide range of goals. They do, first, initially, they're looking at dosing, and then toxicity, side effects. At every phase, they're always looking for new side effects as there's more experience with the medicine or treatment. And they sometimes compare treatments to each other. Why are we having clinical trials? Because this is how science advances, and we know that science is moving at a very, very fast pace. Molecular genetics has just changed the way people are diagnosed completely. And to be in a trial, it is a way for science to gain new knowledge and for you to gain new knowledge. And it also provides evidence that something works or doesn't work. So why would you want to do this? There's ethical reasons that people have to submit their trial on clinicaltrials.gov. It's the responsibility of the investigator to make this information public, and it's part of being an ethical researcher with integrity. It gives evidence to the trial that other colleagues around the world can point to that trial and say, well, that trial only had this many people. That's not a big enough sample, we believe. Maybe it should have, a larger sample. But some rare diseases, you can't get a big enough sample, and, it's a very limited amount of people that can try it, but still, that's useful information for a rare disease, and it's required by NIH policy. So this was a slide that I had put in just generally primary immune deficiency, and these numbers in those continents say how many trials were ongoing, not specific, just very general. So you can see the United States here has tens of thousands more than like South America or China over here. When you are looking on clinicaltrials.gov, you can find trials to volunteer for. You have to examine the screens very carefully and look at the entry criteria. We're going to look at some of those screens. And you can see, what was the original source of the trial? Was it started by a drug company? Is it just academic? And I'll show you this in a minute. Let's see. Some of this is just busy stuff, laws that require submission. Every trial has a unique number. Posting of a trial on clinicaltrials.gov does not mean that it is endorsed by the NIH or that it's an NIH paid-for trial. Choosing to participate is an important personal decision that you should talk about with your doctor and your family to decide if you want to join. And always you can withdraw with no consequences at any time. Let's see. Who approves the drug? So every institution, including the NIH, Every institute at NIH almost has their own institutional review board that very seriously reviews all the aspects of the trial and the safety and, projected usefulness of a trial. But safety is absolutely paramount. The purpose is to ensure that the study meets ethical standards and the rights and welfare of the participants are protected, particularly children and other vulnerable populations. Every trial has an informed consent. Every patient that comes to NIH is on a clinical trial. We are utterly protocol driven. This is the largest research hospital in the world. So you can be sure that if it's an NIH study, it has absolutely been through the IRB. Okay, I'm sorry. Okay, we gotta hurry. We'll go to the demonstration. Okay, here is also a reasonably simple site. So you can, on that line where it says find studies, these are the different places you can start. Find, description, submit a study, resources. So in the blue box, search for studies, that's where you would type in, the name of the disorder that you want, or if you want to be more general, and then, hit enter. And this will, on the right, you see that little pie chart, how many more are in the U.S. than the rest of the world. And so this was one I tried on GATA2. And you can see it starts on the left, what the status is, if they're recruiting. And number 3 is completed and has results, so you can look at that. That was a transplant for monomac, which is one of the infections that people with GATA2 get. The next one was recruited. The 5th one, unknown. That's interesting. I don't know what that means. And it doesn't even seem like it fits. Natural killer cells following bariatric surgery, nothing to do with GATA2. Who knows? The last one, enrolling by invitation. So you have to open that and see who are they trying to enroll. Maybe it's the next column, conditions, they only want these specific mutations, and it's interesting. So that is at NIH. That would be interesting. So sometimes that is not a treatment study. That is a laboratory study, and that would require samples. And maybe it might go on to another treatment study, but like the first one also is a natural history study. The second one is a transplant for GATA2 and other mutations. And you can see all the other details. So here were 61 studies for Job syndrome. And you can't tell much from this. You have to open each one and look at where it is, and you can look at what are the entry criteria or what are the eligibility criteria. This is another way to search. If by topic, you can just pick on the alphabet letter, and it'll just tell you how many studies. You just have to browse one by one and see what might be interesting. Or by category, if you want to just look at blood and lymph conditions, broad. You'll get a lot of stuff, not all of which is relevant at all. So you have to examine each one very carefully. So this was a general one for primary immune deficiency, over 2,800 studies. And the first one is in Switzerland, but by invitation. So you got to open that. Your doctor has to find the person to contact. You have to make contact. You have to see if you're eligible. You have to probably pay your travel over there. It's probably a big deal. The next one, I don't know what ACE is for GammaGuard, but this probably was a drug company study, but it's not yet opened. And these, under interventions, these are the kinds of things that you would be doing week by week. This is an international map that shows how many studies broadly are just for primary immune deficiency. But maybe that's not good enough for you. Maybe you want something more specific, so you just have to search more specifically. And you can see the range across the country where academic medical centers are or where major hospitals are that are doing these studies. Sometimes they're just in your doctor's office, and you have to examine all these things. But still, consent is required, review is required, monitoring is required. Everything is going to apply wherever the study is. Okay, here's one for SCID, and this is a more advanced search instead of the general box. And you can, on these little arrows, you can dial down. Study type would be what phase it's in. Study results, if there were results. Recruitment, if it's open or closed or whatever. Then you could limit it by age or by gender. You can limit it by state, if you only want to stay in your state, if you only want to stay in your 5-state area, or you want to go to Europe, you can do that. You can just dial it in. So here's 77 for SCID, and it's the same thing, recruiting, completed, And then, look at the locations on the right. Children's Hospital of Los Angeles, Boston Children's, University of Minnesota, and 3 more. So you can browse that if that's something that's useful to you. This is all very flexible, very fluid. You can browse and browse to the tiniest detail. You have to consider the kind of disease and if you're able to do travel. How far is too far to travel? Maybe you want to stay in your neighborhood because you want your family to come visit you, but if you don't mind traveling to NIH, we're happy to have you. Some studies recruit nationally. Sometimes they're just surveys. Still requires a consent. And those are not necessarily possible to find in clinicaltrials.gov. So this RSS feeds means Rich Site Summary. And this is like those MLS listings for your house. And you can build a search in here that will feed when there's a new trial. That'll, like when you get a bing, there's a new house on the block you want to live on. You can set this up to create a frequent notification system when you never know when a new trial is going to get approved and whatever. So you just have to browse around here. And many other organizations exist to provide support. And there are organizations, breast cancer trials specifically, Research Match. And you should ask these questions. What is being studied? Why do they think the intervention may or not be effective? What possible interventions might I receive? How will this be determined? How do you consider the risks and the side effects? You have to ask all these questions because you have to be completely informed. Even though it's voluntary, everything is voluntary, you have to know what you're getting into going in. Okay? Yeah. Well, that's it. Okay. Thank you so much.